Wyoming Territory, 1885. A rugged landscape of towering mountains and boundless prairie, where fortunes were carved from unforgiving earth and dreams were tested against harsh realities. The unspoken rules of frontier life were simple. Work. From sunup to sundown, never take more than your share, and above all, know your place in the unwritten hierarchy of those who arrived first and those who came after. For the wealthy seeking adventure or reinvention in these untamed lands, acceptance was earned through sweat and perseverance, never purchased with Eastern dollars or family connections. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But what happens when a woman running from one life unknowingly walks into someone else's carefully orchestrated vengeance? This is the story of Emily Wilson, a banker's daughter from New York's elite society whose desire for freedom led her to answer an advertisement seeking a bride in Wyoming Territory. Unaware that her family name was precisely why she'd been chosen. In the shadow of the Medicine Bow Mountains, Emily would discover that the charming letters from a frontier rancher named Jack Miller contained more than romantic promises. They held the seeds of a decade-old grievance, a debt he believed could only be paid in Wilson's suffering. Emily Wilson stood on the train platform in Pine Valley, Wyoming Territory, fighting to keep her hat from being torn away by the merciless wind. The small frontier settlement stretched before her, a dusty main street lined with weathered buildings that bore little resemblance to the thriving community described in Jack Miller's letters. Where New York had gleaming department stores and elegant restaurants, Pine Valley had a general store with peeling paint, a saloon with broken windows, hastily repaired with parchment paper, and a collection of structures that seemed to huddle together against the vast emptiness surrounding them. At 26, Emily had left behind more than just her family's Fifth Avenue mansion. She had abandoned a future meticulously planned by her father, a strategic marriage to Lawrence Blackwell, his business partner 30 years her senior, whose financial acumen was matched only by his cold demeanor and wandering eye. The arrangement had been presented as a business merger rather than a marriage proposal, with Emily's consent considered an irrelevant formality. "You'll be Mrs. Lawrence Blackwell by autumn," her father had announced over breakfast, not bothering to look up from his newspaper. "The announcement will run in tomorrow's society pages." That evening, Emily had stood in her father's study, surrounded by the trappings of wealth accumulated through 3 generations of Wilson banking success, and felt nothing but suffocation. The leather-bound books no one read, the artwork purchased for investment rather than appreciation, the heavy furniture designed to intimidate rather than comfort, all symbols of a life where appearances mattered more than authenticity. Her mother, long resigned to her ornamental role in Henry Wilson's empire, had offered only token resistance. "Darling, surely Lawrence isn't so terrible. Think of the position you'll have in society." The unspoken truth hung between them. In their world, a woman's value was measured by the man who claimed her and the connections that marriage secured. The advertisement in the Eastern Chronicle had seemed like Providence's answer to Emily's silent prayers. "Established rancher, seeks refined lady of good character for marriage, must appreciate honest work and Wyoming's natural splendor, passage paid." After an exchange of letters spanning 3 months, letters filled with descriptions of mountain vistas and honest frontier life, Emily had made her decision. She withdrew funds from her personal account, took her grandmother's jewelry from the family safe, and departed on the westbound train while her parents attended a weekend in Newport. Now, standing in Wyoming's relentless wind with her carefully packed trunks beside her, Emily wondered if she had traded one form of imprisonment for another even less forgiving. "Miss Wilson." A man approached, removing his hat to reveal sandy hair streaked with premature grey at the temples. This was Thomas Reynolds, the town mayor whose correspondence had arranged her final travel details. His expression betrayed confusion and poorly disguised disappointment as he assessed her appearance. "Yes, Mr. Reynolds, how lovely to meet you in person after our correspondence." Emily extended her gloved hand, painfully aware that her traveling suit, though the simplest in her wardrobe, still marked her as unmistakably Eastern and wealthy. Reynolds took her hand briefly, his calloused palm rough against her fine leather gloves. "The journey from Cheyenne wasn't too difficult, I hope." "Quite manageable," Emily replied diplomatically, omitting mention of the cramped stagecoach where she'd spent 12 hours wedged between a tobacco-chewing cattle buyer and a missionary with alarming views on hellfire. Reynolds cleared his throat. "Well now, there's been a slight change of plans. Mr. Miller was called away suddenly to handle some trouble with his herd up in the north pasture. He sends his regrets and asks that I see you situated at Mrs. Foster's boarding house until his return tomorrow." Emily masked her disappointment. After months of anticipation, another day's delay seemed trivial, yet she couldn't help but feel unsettled. "Of course, I understand the demands of ranch life cannot always accommodate schedules." "That's right hospitable of you to understand, Miss Wilson." Reynolds seemed relieved by her acceptance. "Most city folk expect everything to run like them fancy pendulum clocks." As they walked down Pine Valley's main street, the curious stares of locals followed their progress. Reynolds pointed out the limited amenities: his general store, which also housed the post office, the Hayes Bank and Land Office, Cooper's Mining Company headquarters, the small church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and 3 saloons, whose business appeared more robust than all other establishments combined. "Mr. Miller mentioned Pine Valley is experiencing considerable growth," Emily observed, struggling to reconcile the dusty reality before her with Jack's written descriptions of a thriving community poised for prosperity. Reynolds puffed his chest slightly. "Indeed we are, Miss Wilson. Why, just last month we had 15 new souls arrive, though 7 moved on after that difficulty with the water rights." He gestured vaguely toward the mountains. "Once Cooper's new silver vein proves out, we'll see a proper boom. Mark my words." The boarding house operated by Margaret Foster stood at the edge of town, a 2-story structure built from solid pine with a wraparound porch and neat curtains in every window. It represented the most civilized building Emily had seen since departing Cheyenne, its appearance suggesting its proprietor valued order amidst frontier chaos. Mrs. Foster herself matched her establishment, a tall, angular woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes that assessed Emily with unnerving thoroughness. "So you're Henry Wilson's daughter," she remarked without preamble after Reynolds had made introductions and hastily departed. Emily stiffened, surprised at the recognition of her family name. "You're familiar with my father?" "Not personally," Mrs. Foster replied, leading Emily to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. "But banking names travel, even to places like Pine Valley, especially after 73. Emily nodded, understanding the reference to the financial panic that had ruined countless businesses and families. Her father had often spoken of it as regrettable but necessary correction in the markets, though she knew the Wilson Bank had not only survived, but thrived in its aftermath by acquiring failing institutions for pennies on the dollar. "I hope you won't find our accommodations too primitive," Mrs. Foster continued, watching Emily survey the simple room with its narrow bed, pine dresser, and small writing desk beneath the window. "We lack 5th Avenue luxuries." "It's lovely," Emily replied sincerely, drawn to the window with its view of distant mountains. "More spacious than my sleeping berth on the train, and considerably more peaceful." Something in Mrs. Foster's expression softened slightly. "Dinner's at 6. We don't stand on ceremony here. You're welcome to explore the town, though there's precious little to see compared to New York. Left alone, Emily unpacked only essentials, carefully securing her grandmother's jewelry pouch beneath a loose floorboard she discovered under the bed, a hiding place seemingly created for precisely such purposes. The remainder of her afternoon was spent observing Pine Valley from her window as children played in the dusty street. Women carried laundry and supplies between buildings, and men gathered in clusters to exchange news or complaints. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The town operated with a rhythm entirely different from New York's frenetic pace. No one hurried, yet everyone seemed purposeful. Connections between people were evident in their interactions. A nod here, a helping hand there. Conversations that required few words between those who shared daily existence in this isolated community. Emily wondered how long it would take before she might belong to this intricate social fabric, or if such belonging was even possible for someone with her background. That evening in the boarding house dining room, Emily found herself the subject of frank curiosity from the other residents. A young schoolteacher named Sarah Johnson, an elderly gentleman who introduced himself only as Doc, and two mining company clerks whose conversation revolved exclusively around silver deposits and water rights disputes. "So you've come to marry Jack Miller," Sarah stated rather than asked, as she passed a bowl of stewed beans. "That's caused quite the stir in our little community." "Is that unusual?" Emily inquired, carefully navigating the unfamiliar territory of frontier directness. For someone to arrive as a mail-order bride— "Not the mail-order part," Doc interjected, his rheumy eyes sharp with interest. "Half the women in the territory came that way. It's the Miller part that's got tongues wagging." "Jack Miller isn't known for socializing," Sarah explained more diplomatically. "After his mother passed, he's kept mostly to himself up at Sunset Ranch, except for business in town. And now, suddenly he's sending for an Eastern bride," one of the clerks added, exchanging a meaningful glance with his companion. "An Eastern banker's daughter, no less." Emily felt a creeping unease at their tone. Mr. Miller's letters suggested he's looking for companionship and help managing his household affairs. Is there something unusual about that? A momentary silence fell across the table before Mrs. Foster intervened. "Nothing unusual about a man wanting a wife, Miss Wilson. Jack Miller runs the largest cattle operation in the county and has built it through honest work. That's more than can be said for some in these parts." The conversation shifted to local matters, the upcoming harvest festival, the minister's gout that had cancelled Sunday services for 3 consecutive weeks, and speculation about whether the schoolteacher would accept the blacksmith's awkwardly delivered courtship. Yet Emily remained distracted by the undercurrent she'd sensed regarding her intended husband and the reaction to their arrangement. Later, as lanterns were extinguished throughout the boarding house, Emily sat at her small desk and opened her journal. The habit of recording her thoughts each evening was one of few personal disciplines she had maintained since childhood. Tonight, she found herself documenting questions rather than certainties. Why would a successful rancher specifically seek an Eastern wife unfamiliar with frontier life? What expectations will I face? And how quickly must I adapt to meet them? Most troubling, why did mention of my father's profession provoke such noticeable reactions? There are connections here I cannot yet see, threads I cannot yet follow. Sleep came fitfully that night, punctuated by dreams of New York, intermingled with unfamiliar landscapes and faceless figures watching from shadowed doorways. Emily woke at dawn to the sound of horses in the street below her window. Drawing back the curtain, she observed a man dismounting before the boarding house, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in practical clothing worn smooth by work rather than fashion. Even from this distance, his movements suggested contained energy and purpose. Jack Miller had arrived to claim his bride. Emily dressed quickly in her simplest day dress, a blue cotton with minimal embellishment that she hoped struck the right balance between respectability and practicality. Her hands trembled slightly as she secured her hair in a style less elaborate than New York fashion demanded, but still more refined than the practical knots she had observed on Pine Valley's women. When she descended to the boarding house parlor, Jack Miller stood with his back to her, examining a faded map of Wyoming Territory that hung on the wall. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and Emily found herself momentarily speechless before his direct gaze. His was not the cultivated handsomeness of New York society men, but something more compelling. A face weathered by sun and wind into planes and angles that spoke of character forged through experience. His eyes, startlingly blue beneath dark, brows assessed her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously seen and obscured. Miss Wilson. His voice matched his letters, deep and measured, though lacking the warmth she had imagined while reading his words. I trust your journey was without incident. Mr. Miller. Emily extended her hand, maintaining the poise that years of social training had ingrained. Yes, quite manageable. Pine Valley is exactly as you described. The small lie seemed necessary. Courtesy. He took her hand briefly, his palm calloused against her skin. Something flickered across his features, a shadow of some emotion she couldn't identify before his expression returned to careful neutrality. I apologize for not meeting you yesterday. Ranch matters can't always be scheduled conveniently. Mr. Reynolds explained the situation perfectly. I understand completely. Mrs. Foster appeared with coffee, her sharp eyes moving between them with undisguised interest. Will you be staying for breakfast, Jack? Sarah made fresh biscuits. Thank you, Margaret, but we should start for the ranch, if Miss Wilson is ready. He turned to Emily. It's a 2-hour ride. Do you have luggage to collect? Yes, 2 trunks, though perhaps not everything is necessary immediately. Emily hesitated, suddenly uncertain about the practicalities of transporting her possessions. I brought the wagon, he replied simply. Robert's loading supplies at Reynolds's store. We'll add your trunks before departing. The efficiency of his planning should have been reassuring, yet Emily sensed something beneath his courteous exterior. A watchfulness, an assessment that went beyond normal curiosity about a new acquaintance. As they stepped onto the porch, she noticed other townspeople had found reasons to be on the street, their attention seemingly casual but unmistakably focused on this first public meeting between Jack Miller and his Eastern bride. People seem quite interested in our arrangement, Emily observed as they walked toward the general store. Small towns run on gossip when silver's not producing, Jack replied, his stride automatically shortening to accommodate her pace. They'll find something new to discuss by week's end. And until then, what exactly are they discussing about us? Jack glanced down at her, something like surprise crossing his features. You're direct. That wasn't evident in your letters. Circumstances necessitate adaptation, Emily replied. I'd prefer to understand my situation clearly rather than stumble through assumptions. A corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. They're wondering why Jack Miller, who's avoided town gatherings and social invitations for years, suddenly sent for a bride from New York, and not just any bride, but a Wilson. Before Emily could pursue this cryptic statement, they reached Reynolds' general store, where a man was securing supplies in a wagon. Jack introduced him as Robert Parker, his foreman. Parker nodded respectfully to Emily, his weathered face, revealing nothing of his thoughts, though his eyes lingered on her fine boots and the quality of her traveling coat. With Emily's trunks loaded and farewells made to Mrs. Foster, they departed Pine Valley. Jack and Emily in the wagon seat with Parker following on horseback. As buildings gave way to open country, Emily felt the vastness of Wyoming Territory unfold around her. The landscape stretched toward distant mountains in a patchwork of sage-dotted plains and pine-covered foothills, the October sun casting long shadows across terrain, unlike anything in her experience. "It's breathtaking," she said softly, understanding for the first time the inadequacy of Jack's written descriptions. No words could capture the immensity of this sky, the quality of light across the grasslands, or the sense of possibility contained. In such boundless space, Jack glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Most Easterners find it overwhelming, too empty compared to their crowded cities. "Not empty," Emily countered, "just filled with different things. In New York, we measure space in buildings and blocks. Here you measure in horizons." Something shifted in his posture, a slight easing of tension she hadn't fully registered until it changed. "Your letters suggested you might understand that. Most don't." As the wagon followed a well-worn trail through increasingly rugged terrain, Emily gathered her courage to address the question that had lingered since their meeting. "Mr. Miller, you mentioned the townspeople's interest in my family name specifically. May I ask why the name Wilson holds particular significance here?" The relaxation she'd noted vanished instantly. Jack's hands tightened on the reins, his profile hardening as he kept his gaze fixed on the trail ahead. "Banking names travel, Miss Wilson, especially those associated with the Panic of '73. "My father's bank," Emily acknowledged, feeling a peculiar sense of dread gathering. "But surely Wyoming Territory is rather far from New York financial concerns. Distance doesn't matter when foreclosure notices arrive by mail." The flatness in his tone conveyed more than anger might have. The Wilson Banking and Trust Company didn't need to travel west in person to acquire properties at auction. Emily felt suddenly cold, despite the autumn sunshine. "Are you suggesting my father's bank had business interests in Pine Valley?" "Not the town specifically." Jack guided the horses around a sharp bend where the trail narrowed between rock outcroppings. But Wyoming Territory saw its share of Wilson foreclosures during the panic. Eastern loans called in without warning, properties seized and resold for fractions of their value. "I see." Emily didn't fully see, not yet, but pieces were beginning to align in disturbing patterns, and this knowledge made my arrival notable to the townspeople. You could say that. They traveled in silence for several minutes. The only sounds, the creak of wagon wheels and the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth. Emily's mind raced through implications, through the careful phrasing of Jack's letters that had never mentioned his awareness of her family, through the furious reactions her surname had provoked since her arrival. "Mr. Miller," she finally said, her voice steadier than she felt, "did you advertise for a bride with the specific intention of bringing a Wilson to Wyoming Territory?" The directness of her question seemed to catch him off guard. He turned to look at her fully, those blue eyes narrowing slightly as he assessed her expression. "Would it matter if I had?" "It would matter considerably to me," Emily replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Honesty between us seems essential, particularly if we're considering marriage." For a moment, something like respect flickered across his features. Then his attention returned to the trail as they began ascending a steeper incline. "I advertised for a bride because my ranch needs a woman's management. The Wilson part..." He paused. "Let's call it an unexpected opportunity when you responded." "Opportunity for what exactly?" Emily pressed, even as apprehension grew. Before he could answer, Robert Parker called from behind them, pointing toward a ridge where dust clouds indicated moving cattle. "Riders coming in from the North Range, Jack. Looks like Davis and the boys." The interruption closed whatever window had briefly opened for honesty. Jack nodded acknowledgement to his foreman, then gestured toward the valley opening before them. "Sunset Ranch, Miss Wilson. Your potential new home, assuming our arrangement proves satisfactory to both parties." Emily followed his gesture, momentarily distracted from her concerns by the scene below. The ranch spread across the valley floor. A substantial main house built of squared logs with a wraparound porch, several outbuildings forming a courtyard, corrals and barn structures arranged with obvious planning, and beyond them, fenced. Pastures stretching toward a creek that cut through the property like a silver ribbon. Unlike the haphazard construction she'd observed in town, Sunset Ranch displayed evidence of careful design and prosperity. Smoke rose from the main house chimney, chickens pecked in a fenced yard, and several horses grazed in a nearby corral. Against the backdrop of rugged mountains, the ranch appeared both impressive and somehow vulnerable, a human claim staked in wilderness that seemed to tolerate rather than welcome such presumption. "It's beautiful," Emily said truthfully, even as her mind continued processing the troubling implications of their exchange. Whatever Jack Miller's opportunity entailed regarding her family name, she had traveled too far and risked too much. To retreat at the first sign of complications, better to understand the situation fully before making decisions. As they descended toward the ranch, Emily squared her shoulders and composed her expression into one of appropriate interest rather than suspicion. She had navigated New York society's treacherous currents since childhood. Surely she could manage one Wyoming rancher with an apparent grudge against her family. What she couldn't yet know was how deeply that grudge had rooted, or how carefully. Jack Miller had planned for the arrival of Henry Wilson's daughter. The wagon rolled into the courtyard of Sunset Ranch, where two ranch hands immediately appeared to help with Emily's trunks. Jack jumped down and offered his hand to assist her, a gesture of frontier courtesy that felt perfunctory rather than gallant. Emily accepted his help with practiced grace, taking the opportunity to observe her surroundings more closely. The main house was larger than it had appeared from the ridge. Two full stories with dormer windows, suggesting additional rooms in the attic space. The logs had been carefully finished and sealed against Wyoming's harsh weather, and the wide porch wrapped around three sides, offering views of both the mountains and the creek that gave the property its name. Compared to the rudimentary buildings of Pine Valley, Sunset Ranch represented substantial prosperity and permanence. "Mrs. Winters runs the household," Jack explained, leading Emily toward the front door. "She's been with the ranch since—" He paused almost imperceptibly. "For many years." The door opened before they reached it, revealing a stout woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and keen eyes that assessed Emily with undisguised curiosity. Her plain dress and practical apron spoke of function over fashion, but the neat embroidery at her collar suggested attention to detail. "So you've brought her then," Mrs. Winters remarked to Jack, her tone neither approving nor disapproving, merely acknowledging a fact. "Miss Emily Wilson, this is Mrs. Edith Winters." Jack made the introduction with formal correctness. "Mrs. Winters, Miss Wilson has traveled from New York to consider our arrangement." "New York?" Mrs. Winters repeated, her gaze traveling from Emily's hat to her boots in a single sweep. "Quite a journey. Come in then. I've prepared the guest room, not presuming anything." The interior of the ranch house surprised Emily with its unexpected refinement. Where she had anticipated rustic frontier accommodations, she found well-crafted furniture, polished wood floors softened by woven rugs, and walls adorned with a curious mixture of practical implements and genuine artwork. A piano stood in the corner of the main room, dusty but apparently well-maintained. "You play?" Emily asked Jack, nodding toward the instrument. A shadow crossed his features. "My mother did. No one plays it now." Mrs. Winters led them through the house, pointing out the dining room, study, kitchen, and back porch, before taking Emily upstairs to a comfortable guest room with windows facing the mountains. The furnishings were simple but of good quality. A brass bed with a colorful quilt, an oak dresser with mirror, a washstand with porcelain basin, and a small writing desk beneath the window. This was Frank's room before he left for law school, Mrs. Winters explained, opening the wardrobe to show empty space for Emily's belongings. Jack's brother, she added, noting Emily's questioning look. He's in St. Louis now. I didn't realize Mr. Miller had a brother, Emily said, removing her hat and gloves. He didn't mention family in his letters. Something like disapproval tightened Mrs. Winters' mouth. No, he wouldn't have. She smoothed her apron with work-roughened hands. Supper's at 6. You have time to rest and freshen up. Water's in the pitcher, towels in the chest. Once alone, Emily moved to the window, watching as Jack conversed with Robert Parker in the courtyard below. Their discussion appeared intense, with Jack gesturing toward the northern pastures and Parker shaking his head in apparent disagreement. Neither man smiled or showed any sign of the satisfaction one might expect following the successful arrival of a potential bride. Emily unpacked only what she needed for the evening, keeping her movements methodical as she attempted to order. Her thoughts. The day had delivered a series of subtle but unmistakable warnings. Jack's cryptic comments about the Wilson name, the townspeople's reaction to her arrival, Mrs. Winters' careful neutrality, and the peculiar absence of information about Jack's family in their correspondence. Hidden within her largest trunk was a small wooden box containing treasures from her previous life. Her mother's cameo, her grandmother's pearls, several gold coins her governess had advised every woman should keep for emergencies, and most importantly, her journal with its record of the past months. Emily retrieved the journal and settled at the desk, determined to document her observations while they remained fresh. Sunset Ranch is impressive in scale and prosperity, she wrote, suggesting Mr. Miller's business acumen exceeds what his modest letters implied. Yet there is a curious tension underlying the cordial welcome, references to banking collapses and the Wilson name that hint at some historical grievance. Mrs. Winters mentioned a brother studying law, though Mr. Miller never referenced family. In our correspondence, what else might he have omitted? I must proceed cautiously until I understand the undercurrents of this household. The dinner bell interrupted her reflections. Emily quickly changed into a simple evening dress, modest by New York standards, but still more formal than frontier custom required. She hesitated over her jewelry before selecting only a small silver pendant that had belonged to her grandmother, deliberately avoiding anything that might advertise her family's wealth. The dining room, like the rest of the house, reflected comfortable prosperity without ostentation. The table could seat 8, but had been set for 3, with Jack at the head and places for Emily and Mrs. Winters on either side. A 4th setting had been added at the last minute, Emily noted, as Robert Parker entered from the kitchen behind Mrs. Winters, who carried a large tureen of fragrant stew. Conversation during the meal focused on practical matters: the weather, forecast for the coming weeks, the progress of ranch operations, the final preparations for winter that needed completion before the first heavy snow. Emily listened attentively, gathering more information about Sunset Ranch's operations than asking direct questions might have yielded. The cattle drive to the rail junction was successful then? She inquired during a lull, recalling a reference to this undertaking in one of Jack's letters. Jack glanced at her with mild surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to follow such details. Yes, prices were better than last year, though still not what they should be with Chicago demand rising. Supply chains and transportation costs dominate the market more than end consumer demand, Emily observed. My father often commented that producers rarely capture their fair share of final market value. A weighted silence followed her comment. Parker studied his plate with sudden interest, while Mrs. Winter's eyes darted quickly between Jack and Emily. "Your father would know about capturing value," Jack finally said, his tone carefully neutral. "Wilson Banking made quite a science of it during the panic." Emily met his gaze directly. "I believe every business aims to operate profitably, Mr. Miller. Banking is no exception. At whose expense is the real question." Jack cut a piece of meat with precise movements, but perhaps that's too heavy a topic for dinner conversation with a new arrival. Mrs. Winters intervened smoothly. "Miss Wilson, you must be exhausted after your journey. Would you prefer coffee or tea with dessert? I've made apple pie from our orchard's first harvest." The conversation shifted to safer territory. The ranch's small orchard, the relative merits of different apple varieties for cooking versus eating, and Mrs. Winter's reputation for the best preserved fruits in the county. Yet Emily remained acutely aware of the current running beneath these pleasantries, the unspoken history that seemed to shadow every interaction. After dinner, Jack invited Emily to the porch where the October evening had painted the mountains, in deepening shades of purple against a sky still faintly illuminated at the horizon. The air carried the scent of pine and sage, with a sharpness that promised frost by morning. They sat in sturdy rocking chairs, separated by a small table where Mrs. Winters had placed a lantern against the gathering darkness. "Your letters described these sunsets," Emily said, breaking a silence that had stretched uncomfortably long, "though words hardly do them justice." "That's true of many things out here," Jack replied, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks. "Eastern language doesn't always translate to Western realities. Then perhaps we should speak plainly, Mr. Miller." Emily turned to face him fully. "Your reaction to my family name suggests some history I wasn't aware of when I accepted your invitation. I'd appreciate understanding what that might be before we discuss our potential arrangement further." Jack's expression remained impassive, though his hands stilled on the chair arms. "Direct again. That quality might serve you well here, Miss Wilson, if you stay." "If that's to be determined, clarity seems essential." He nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision. The Wilson Banking and Trust Company foreclosed on dozens of Wyoming properties during the Panic of '73. Properties that had received loans the previous year with promises of 5-year terms, only to have those terms suddenly changed when Eastern markets collapsed. "I was 14 in 1873, Emily noted, hardly in a position to influence banking policy." "No," Jack acknowledged, "but you benefited from it nonetheless. The Wilson Mansion on Fifth Avenue, your education at private academies, your entire life of privilege, all built partially on the broken dreams of people who actually worked the land rather than shuffling paper in Manhattan offices." The bitterness in his tone confirmed Emily's growing suspicion. "Your family was among those affected." Jack turned to look at her directly, the lantern light casting harsh shadows across his features. "My father built the original Sunset Ranch with his own hands after the war. 20 years of work. When drought hit in '72, he took a loan from an agent of Wilson Banking to carry us through. Standard terms, reasonable interest, 5 years to repay. Less than a year later, a letter arrived demanding immediate payment in full." Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "And when he couldn't pay? When he couldn't produce cash equal to 5 years of cattle profits? Within 30 days, Wilson Banking sold our note to speculators. The property went to auction for pennies on the dollar." Jack's voice remained level, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the chair arms. "My father didn't survive the shock. My mother took in laundry in Pine Valley to keep my brother and me fed. She died of pneumonia 3 years later, working herself to exhaustion, trying to save enough for us to reclaim even a portion of what had been stolen." The story was painfully familiar to Emily. one of countless similar tales from the financial panic that had ruined lives across the country. Her father had always discussed such matters in abstract terms of market corrections and necessary consolidations, never acknowledging the human cost of decisions made in mahogany-paneled boardrooms. "I'm truly sorry for your family's suffering," she said quietly. "Truly. But I'm still unclear how this connects to my presence here. You've obviously rebuilt successfully." A strange expression crossed Jack's face, something between grim satisfaction and reluctance. 12 years of working other men's cattle, saving every penny, taking the most dangerous jobs for higher wages. When the property came up for sale, again in '85, I had just enough to make the down payment. I named it Sunset Ranch instead of Miller Ranch because that's what it is now, something new built on the ashes of what died. "That's admirable persistence," Emily said, meaning it sincerely. "You should be proud of what you've accomplished." "Pride wasn't what drove me," Jack replied, his eyes reflecting the lantern flame. "Understanding was. Understanding exactly how Eastern money operates, how it destroys without ever seeing the consequences, how it views people like my parents as entries in a ledger rather than human beings with lives and dreams." Emily felt a growing unease. "And inviting me here, was that part of this understanding?" Jack was silent for a long moment, his gaze returning to the darkened mountains. "When I placed that advertisement, I had no specific intention beyond finding someone to help manage the household. When a letter arrived signed Emily Wilson with a Fifth Avenue return address, it seemed like." He paused, searching for the right word, like fate offering a chance for balance. "Balance," Emily repeated carefully. "Or revenge. Would revenge be unjustified?" He turned back to her, his expression unreadable in the growing darkness. "The Wilson Banking and Trust Company took everything from my family without a second thought. Perhaps it's fitting that a Wilson should experience life on the other side of their ledgers." The implications settled over Emily like a physical weight. "You brought me here to punish me for my father's business practices, practices I had no control over and limited understanding of as a child?" "I brought you here because you responded to my advertisement," Jack countered. "You chose to travel west, apparently fleeing something in New York. I merely recognized the irony of a Wilson seeking refuge on land their bank once seized." "That's not an answer, Mr. Miller." He stood abruptly, moving to the porch railing, where he stood with his back to her, shoulders rigid. "No, it's not. The truth is, I don't know exactly what I intended. When your letter arrived, I saw an opportunity to understand the people who destroyed my family, to see a Wilson close up, to perhaps make one of you comprehend what your wealth really costs others." Emily remained seated, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. The rational response would be to demand return to Pine Valley immediately, to seek passage back to civilization, far from this man whose family grievance had drawn her into an unexpected reckoning. Yet something held her in place, perhaps the same instinct for independence that had driven her west in the first place. "I am not my father," she said finally, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "Nor am I my family's bank. I came west, seeking something honest, work that matters, a life beyond social obligations and arranged marriages. If you invited me here under false pretenses, that reflects on your character, not mine." Jack turned slowly, studying her with an expression that had shifted from resentment to something more complex, perhaps reluctant respect. "Fair enough, but knowing what you know now, why would you stay?" "I haven't decided that I will," Emily replied honestly. "But if I leave, it will be my choice based on clear facts, not a retreat from uncomfortable truths. I've had enough of men making decisions about my life without my informed consent." Something in her tone must have conveyed the weight behind her words. Jack's expression softened slightly. Your father arranged a marriage? That's what you're running from? My father arranged my entire existence, Emily said, surprising herself with the bitterness that crept into her voice. My education, my social calendar, my acceptable acquaintances, all designed to position me as an asset for eventual merger with a business associate 30 years my senior who's buried 2 wives already. Lawrence Blackwell, Jack said, the name clearly familiar to him. Emily stared in surprise. You know of him? Blackwell Mining and Investment. They've been buying properties throughout the territory, including foreclosed ranches. Jack's expression darkened. Your father has extensive business with him. And extensive plans for me, Emily confirmed, a humorless smile touching her lips. The announcement was to run in the social pages. I left the night before. A complicated silence fell between them, filled only with the soft chorus of night, insects, and the occasional distant lowing of cattle. They had each revealed vulnerabilities neither had intended, creating an unexpected and uncomfortable intimacy. So, Jack finally said, his tone more measured than before, we find ourselves in an unusual situation. You fled an unwanted marriage to a man your father selected, only to arrive at the doorstep of someone with significant grievances against your family. Life's ironies seem determined to educate me, Emily observed dryly. The question is, what happens now? Do you still wish to consider me as a potential wife, knowing I'm Henry Wilson's daughter? Or was that never truly your intention? Jack returned to his chair, moving with the deliberate care of a man choosing his path. I advertised for a bride because Sunset Ranch needs a woman's management. Mrs. Winters is getting older and running. A cattle operation this size requires more than just ranch hands and foremen. He met her gaze directly. That need remains, regardless of your surname. But your feelings about my family complicate matters considerably. Yes, he acknowledged without hesitation. They do. Emily considered their situation from multiple angles, applying the practical analysis her father had unwittingly taught her through years of overheard business discussions. I propose a compromise, Mr. Miller. 1 month. I'll remain at Sunset Ranch for 1 month as your guest, not your bride, not yet. During that time, I'll assist Mrs. Winters and learn about ranch operations. You'll have opportunity to know me as Emily, not merely as a Wilson. At month's end, we both decide whether to proceed with the original arrangement. Jack studied her with obvious surprise. Most women in your position would be demanding immediate return to civilization. I'm beginning to think I'm not like most women, Emily replied. And civilization, as you call it, holds little appeal after what I've experienced of it. 1 month seems a fair trial for both of us. After a long moment, Jack nodded slowly. 1 month, no commitments beyond that until we both agree. He extended his hand to seal their arrangement. Emily accepted the handshake, noting the calluses that testified to years of physical labor. Hands utterly unlike the smooth, manicured fingers of New York businessmen. Whatever else Jack Miller might be, he had earned his position through actual work rather than manipulation of markets and vulnerable borrowers. We should establish some parameters, Jack continued, all business now that the initial agreement had been reached. You'll have freedom of the ranch house and immediate grounds. If you wish to ride or travel beyond the home pasture, take Robert or one of the hands with you, not because you're a prisoner, but because the territory can be dangerous for those unfamiliar with it. Reasonable, Emily agreed. And my responsibilities? Assist Mrs. Winters as she requests. Learn the household operations. Observe ranch management if it interests you. He hesitated before adding, the piano hasn't been played in years. If you're musical, you'd be welcome to use it. The unexpected offer, personal rather than practical, suggested complexity. Beyond the grievance he had revealed, Emily nodded her acceptance. "I had lessons, though I was never particularly talented. Perhaps the instrument needs attention after sitting idle so long. Mrs. Winters can show you where the key to the bench is kept." Jack rose, signaling the end of their conversation. "You must be tired after your journey. Tomorrow will be soon enough to begin learning Sunset Ranch's operations." As Emily prepared for bed in the guest room that would be hers for the next month, she reviewed the day's revelations with the methodical thoroughness her father had applied to financial statements. Jack Miller clearly harbored deep resentment toward the Wilson name and all it represented, justifiably so if his account of the foreclosure was accurate. Yet he had been honest when confronted directly, and the arrangement they had negotiated offered her something she had rarely experienced: agency in determining her own future. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had fled one man's attempt to control her destiny, only to encounter another whose past grievances might easily have made her a target for retribution. Instead, they had reached a pragmatic compromise that acknowledged both history and present circumstances. Whatever Jack's initial intentions in bringing a Wilson to Wyoming Territory, he had ultimately offered her fair terms and the dignity of choice. From her window, Emily could see the main ranch yard illuminated by moonlight. Jack stood near the corral, deep in conversation with Robert Parker. Their postures suggested disagreement, Parker gesturing emphatically while Jack shook his head. After several minutes, Parker threw up his hands in apparent frustration and stalked toward the bunkhouse, leaving Jack alone in the silver-washed darkness. For a long moment, he remained motionless, staring toward the mountains as if seeking answers in their ancient silhouettes. Then he turned slowly, his gaze lifting to Emily's window, where she stood partially concealed by curtains. Though distance made it impossible for him to see her clearly, Emily had the distinct impression he knew she was watching, that he had sensed her presence with the same inexplicable awareness that allowed him to anticipate his cattle's movements, or read approaching weather in subtle shifts of wind. She stepped back from the window, unsettled by the connection yet reluctant to break it. Jack Miller represented everything she had been raised to dismiss: frontier pragmatism over Eastern, sophistication, physical labor over intellectual pursuits, direct confrontation over social maneuvering. He was simultaneously her adversary through historical grievance and her potential ally against the future her father had planned. Most troubling of all, despite his admitted resentment of her family, Emily found herself respecting his honesty and resilience in ways she had rarely experienced with the polished gentleman of New York society. He had survived tragedy, rebuilt through sheer determination, and when confronted with the complexity of holding an individual accountable for institutional wrongs, had chosen compromise over revenge. The Mary Wilson who had boarded a train in New York would have found such qualities unremarkable, admirable in an abstract sense, but irrelevant to a life governed by social calendars and suitable marriages. The Emily Wilson who now stood in a Wyoming ranch house, independent and facing an uncertain future of her own choosing, recognized them as essential to survival in this unforgiving landscape. Tomorrow would begin her education in frontier life, not as a temporary visitor observing quaint customs from a position of privileged distance, but as a potential participant in the daily work that sustained existence far from Eastern comforts. The prospect was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Emily turned from the window and opened her journal once more, recording a final observation before sleep claimed her. "I came west, seeking escape from one man's control, only to find myself negotiating terms with another whose family history gives him every reason to resent my presence. Yet in this strange circumstance, I've been granted what New York never offered: the dignity of determining my own path, based on truth rather than social convenience. 1 month to discover whether Emily Wilson can exist separate from the privilege and obligations of her family name." 1 month to determine if Sunset Ranch represents genuine opportunity or merely another form of confinement dressed in frontier clothing. The dawn arrived with crystalline clarity, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose that stole Emily's breath when she first opened her curtains. In New York, buildings blocked such expansive views, and morning light filtered through coal smoke and fog to create a diffuse glow rather than this radiant transformation of landscape. She dressed pragmatically in her plainest skirt and shirtwaist, adding a warm shawl against the morning chill. Her hair she arranged simply, foregoing the elaborate styles that had required her lady's maid's assistance in New York. If she was to learn ranch operations, practicality must override vanity. The house was already busy when Emily descended the stairs. Mrs. Winters directed 2 young women, sisters from a neighboring homestead, she explained, in the preparation of breakfast for the ranch hands. The kitchen hummed with efficient activity as biscuits emerged from the oven, coffee bubbled in enormous pots, and slabs of ham sizzled in cast-iron skillets. "Early rising is essential here," Mrs. Winters informed Emily, handing her an apron. "Without ceremony. Men need feeding before dawn in winter. Earlier in summer, you can help Martha with the eggs if you've a mind to make yourself useful." The instruction, delivered as statement rather than question, established immediate expectations. Emily accepted the apron and moved to assist the younger sister, who regarded her with undisguised curiosity while demonstrating how to crack eggs efficiently into a large bowl. "Never seen a New York lady before," Martha commented, her hands moving with practiced speed. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Emily asked, attempting to match the girl's pace with limited success. "Fancy clothes, airs and graces, complaints about everything." Martha shrugged. "That's what Ma said when she heard Jack Miller sent for an Eastern bride." "I left the fancy clothes in New York," Emily replied, warming to the girl's directness. "As for complaints, I expect I'll have my share while learning, but I hope to keep them to myself when possible." Martha grinned unexpectedly. "That's fair. Ma says everyone's entitled to private grumbling, but public doing." She lowered her voice. "Is it true you're Henry Wilson's daughter, the banking man?" The question confirmed that word of Emily's. Identity had spread beyond the ranch, unsurprising in territory where news traveled faster than mail. "Yes, though I'm here as myself, not as my father's representative." "Brave of you," Martha observed cryptically, returning her attention to the eggs. "Most wouldn't dare, knowing the history." Before Emily could inquire further, Mrs. Winters called for the eggs, and the conversation ended as breakfast service began. Emily found herself assigned to pouring coffee as ranch hands filed in from the bunkhouse, a dozen men of varying ages who nodded respectfully in her direction, but addressed their morning conversation to each other or to Mrs. Winters. Jack entered last, having apparently already been to the stables. He acknowledged Emily with a brief nod before joining the men at the long table. The meal proceeded with minimal conversation. The workers focused on refueling bodies already engaged in morning chores. Within 20 minutes they had departed to their assignments, leaving the kitchen staff to clean up and prepare for the household's later breakfast. "You'll eat with us now they're done," Mrs. Winters informed Emily, indicating a smaller table in the kitchen's corner. "No sense making 2 services when there's work waiting." The practical efficiency of ranch life impressed Emily, who had grown up in a household where elaborate rituals surrounded each meal. Here, function dictated form, food was fuel, schedules followed natural rhythms of light and darkness, and every task connected directly to survival. After breakfast, Mrs. Winters provided a more comprehensive tour of the ranch house and outbuildings. explaining systems for water management, food storage, laundry, and household maintenance that had evolved over years of frontier necessity. Emily listened attentively, recognizing that her survival at Sunset Ranch and her ability to contribute meaningfully depended on mastering these essential operations. "Jack mentioned you might be musical," Mrs. Winters remarked as they passed. The piano in the main room. Ruth Miller, his mother, played beautifully. Sunday evenings she'd have all the hands in singing hymns and popular songs. None of that after she passed, of course. "How old was Jack when he lost his mother?" Emily asked, running her fingers lightly over the piano's dusty surface. 18. Frank was just 14. Mrs. Winters' expression softened with remembered sorrow. She held on as long as she could, working herself to the bone to keep those boys fed and educated after James Miller died. Made me promise to see them through when she knew the end was coming. "You've been with the family a long time then." I was Ruth's closest friend since girlhood. Came west with her as new brides, both of us. Mrs. Winters opened the piano bench, revealing neatly stacked sheet music. "When they lost everything, I took Jack and Frank into my home. When Jack rebuilt, I came to manage his household. Family isn't always blood, Miss Wilson, especially on the frontier." The woman's loyalty explained her initial reserve toward Emily. She had witnessed the Miller family's destruction and dedicated years to helping rebuild what had been lost. A Wilson, arriving at Sunset Ranch, represented everything that had caused their suffering. "I understand your caution regarding me," Emily said quietly. "You have every reason to question my presence here." Mrs. Winters studied her with shrewd assessment. "Jack's a good man, the best I know. Whatever brought you to his advertisement, you should understand that much. The bank took their land, but it didn't take his character. That's Ruth's doing, made sure her boys understood the difference between losing property and losing dignity." "He seems to have rebuilt impressively," Emily observed, genuine admiration in her tone. "At what cost, though?" Mrs. Winters sighed. 12 years of working himself nearly to death. Taking jobs other men refused, because they paid more if you survived them. Never allowing himself pleasure or rest until he'd reclaimed what was stolen. She closed the piano bench with careful hands. "Got the land back, but not the joy. Not yet." The conversation shifted to practical matters, the afternoon's bread baking, preparation for the evening meal, plans for winter preserving that needed attention before the first heavy frost. Yet Mrs. Winters' words lingered in Emily's thoughts as she followed instructions on proper kneading techniques and learned the kitchen's rhythms. Jack Miller had sacrificed his youth and nearly his life to reclaim his family's legacy. What must it have cost him to see a Wilson arrive at the home he had rebuilt through such effort? Whatever his initial intentions in bringing her to Sunset Ranch, the fact that he'd offered honest compromise rather than rejection or retribution suggested character that transcended understandable bitterness. As Emily punched down bread dough, with flour-covered hands, she reflected on the strange circumstances that had brought her to this kitchen. She had fled New York seeking independence from her father's control, only to land in the home of a man with every reason to resent her. Family's name. Yet here she stood, learning practical skills no finishing school had thought to teach, engaged in work that directly contributed to sustaining life rather than merely adorning it. The irony was not lost on her, nor was the peculiar sense of purpose that had been absent throughout her privileged Eastern existence. For the first time in memory, Emily Wilson's actions had immediate, tangible consequences. Bread that would feed real hunger, preparations that would determine actual comfort through harsh weather, interactions that required genuine rather than performative engagement. Perhaps 1 month at Sunset Ranch would prove an education unlike any her father's money could have purchased. The week unfolded with a rhythm entirely foreign to Emily's experience. Each day began before dawn, with household activities coordinated around the needs of ranch operations. She learned to distinguish the different sounds that marked time more reliably than any clock. The pre-dawn movements of men heading to the stables, the mid-morning pause when riders returned briefly to report or collect supplies, the afternoon lull when heat slowed all but the most essential tasks, and the gradual settling of evening as workers returned from distant pastures. By the fifth day, Emily had established her own place within this pattern. She rose with Mrs. Winters to help prepare breakfast, spent mornings assisting with household tasks, devoted afternoons to learning specific skills under the older woman's tutelage, and evenings attempting to revive the neglected piano. Her hands, once smooth and manicured, now showed the effects of practical work. A small burn from removing bread pans, calluses forming from wringing laundry, nails trimmed short for practicality rather than fashion. The physical demands of ranch life had initially exhausted her, but Emily found unexpected satisfaction in collapsing into bed each night with the bone-deep weariness of genuine accomplishment. Sleep came easily without the social anxieties and familial tensions that had plagued her New York existence. On this particular morning, Emily stood at the kitchen window, watching the first pale light illuminate the ranch yard as she waited for water to boil. Mrs. Winters was consulting with the cook about the day's meals, giving Emily a rare moment of solitude to observe the territory she was gradually coming to understand. Jack emerged from the stables, deep in conversation with Robert Parker. Both men moved with the fluid efficiency that came from years of physical work, their gestures suggesting disagreement without hostility, the ongoing negotiation of men who respected each other's judgment even when it differed from their own. As if sensing her observation, Jack glanced toward the house, his gaze finding her at the window with unsettling accuracy. He nodded briefly in acknowledgement before returning his attention to his foreman. The simple gesture, neither warm nor cold, merely recognizing her presence, typified their interactions since her arrival. After their candid conversation on the porch that first evening, Jack had maintained polite distance, neither avoiding Emily nor seeking her company beyond necessary household discussions. He departed early each morning to work with the cattle or ride fence lines, returning at dusk for the evening meal where conversation focused on ranch operations, weather forecasts, or territorial news carried by passing travelers. Personal topics remained untouched by mutual unspoken agreement. Yet Emily sensed his awareness of her activities through Mrs. Winters' reports and occasional comments that revealed his notice of changes she had implemented. Approval of her reorganization of the pantry stores, acknowledgement of her suggestion regarding more efficient laundry scheduling, appreciation for the evening piano music that now drifted through the house as she practiced. "He's watching, not ignoring," Mrs. Winters had observed yesterday when Emily mentioned Jack's reserved manner, measuring whether you're truly interested in ranch life or just playing at frontier adventure before returning east. "And how am I being measured so far?" Emily had asked, genuinely curious. The older woman had smiled slightly. "You haven't complained about the work or the isolation. That counts for something. But it's early days yet." Now, as Emily moved away from the window to attend the boiling water, she reflected on the peculiar test she was undergoing, proving herself worthy of consideration as a potential ranch wife to a man whose family had suffered directly from her father's business practices. Not merely convincing Jack Miller that she could manage household duties, but demonstrating that Emily Wilson existed separate from the Wilson name and all it represented. Mrs. Winters approached, interrupting her thoughts. "Jack says you're to accompany him to Pine Valley today if you've a mind to. Supply wagon needs restocking, and he thought you might want to select some things personally." Emily looked up in surprise. "He's inviting me to town?" "Asked if you'd like to go." "That's not quite the same as inviting," Mrs. Winters corrected with practical precision. "Town trip happens monthly, weather permitting. Last chance before winter makes the roads difficult." The distinction was meaningful, Jack offering opportunity rather than insisting on companionship. "I'd appreciate the chance to select a few items," Emily replied, thinking of supplies she could use for the household ledgers she had begun reorganizing. "Dress practical," Mrs. Winters advised. "October brings unpredictable weather in these mountains. Wagon leaves after breakfast." 2 hours later, Emily climbed onto the wagon seat beside Jack, wearing her sturdiest skirt and warmest jacket with a woolen scarf securing her hat against the wind. The day had dawned clear but cool, with high clouds suggesting changing weather by afternoon. Robert Parker rode alongside, exchanging occasional comments with Jack about boundary markers and cattle movements observed along their route. Emily remained quiet, absorbing the landscape as they traveled. The journey that had seemed endless, upon her arrival, now revealed its landmarks: distinctive rock formations, creek crossings, stands of aspen trees whose leaves had turned brilliant gold against dark pines. She found herself mapping mental reference points, understanding the territory in ways that went beyond mere observation. "Different perspective in daylight," Jack remarked, correctly reading her attentiveness. "First trip always seems longer because it's unfamiliar. The distance remains the same, but our perception of it changes with experience," Emily agreed. "Like most challenges, I suppose." Something in her phrasing caught his interest. "You consider this journey challenging?" "Not the physical distance," she clarified. "Rather the distance between worlds, New York to Wyoming, banking to ranching, Wilson to—" She hesitated. "To whatever I might become here." Jack studied her briefly before returning his attention to the trail. Most city folk who come west want to remake the territory in the image of what they left behind. They measure success by how effectively they impose Eastern ways on Western circumstances. "That seems rather short-sighted," Emily observed. "Shouldn't adaptation flow in both directions? The newcomer adjusting to the territory's demands while bringing useful knowledge from previous experience." A flicker of surprise crossed Jack's features. "That's not a common perspective among Easterners of my acquaintance. Perhaps I'm not as typical as you assumed." Emily met his gaze directly, challenging the assumptions her family name had created. Before he could respond, Robert Parker called from ahead, pointing toward Pine Valley, now visible in the distance. The small settlement appeared more organized to Emily's eyes than it had upon her arrival, not because the town had changed, but because her reference points had shifted after experiencing the genuine isolation of Sunset Ranch. They reached Pine Valley by mid-morning, the wagon rolling down the main street where curious gazes tracked their progress. Emily noted the subtle shift in Jack's posture as they entered town, a heightened alertness, a watchfulness that suggested complicated history beyond what he had shared about his family's past. "The supply list is substantial," he said as they approached Reynolds' general store. "Winter preparations. We'll divide tasks for efficiency if that suits you." "Of course," Emily agreed, understanding that practical concerns dominated frontier schedules rather than social niceties. Thomas Reynolds greeted their arrival with poorly disguised surprise, his gaze moving between Emily and Jack with obvious curiosity. "Miss Wilson, didn't expect to see you back in town so soon, and in Mr. Miller's company, no less." Mrs. Winters provided a comprehensive list of household supplies needed before winter, Emily replied smoothly, ignoring the implied question about her arrangement with Jack. "I offered to assist with selections while Mr. Miller handles ranch requirements." Her composed response established professional purpose rather than personal connection. a boundary she instinctively erected against the town's inevitable gossip. Jack nodded approval of her approach before moving to discuss feed prices with Reynolds, leaving Emily to examine fabric bolts and household goods along the store's far wall. She had just finished selecting sturdy cotton for new kitchen linens when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Miss Wilson, what an unexpected pleasure." Emily turned to find Daniel Hayes, the banker who had been her third potential suitor, watching her with calculated interest. His tailored suit and gold watch chain marked him as prosperous by Pine Valley standards, though his attire would have appeared provincial in New York drawing rooms. "Mr. Hayes," she acknowledged with polite distance. "Good morning. I must say your departure from town caused quite the stir," Hayes continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "First Jenkins, then Cooper, and finally myself, all deemed unsuitable. Yet here you are in the company of Jack Miller, whose antipathy toward Eastern refinement is well documented throughout the county. The implied criticism of her choices, and the suggestion that town gossip had thoroughly dissected her rejections, stirred a defensive response Emily had not anticipated. I found Sunset Ranch's honest approach refreshing after certain experiences in town, she replied, her tone cooling noticeably. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Honest? An interesting choice of words given the circumstances. He glanced toward Jack, who was deep in conversation with Reynolds across the store. I wonder if you fully understand your situation. My situation is entirely of my own. Choosing, Mr. Hayes, Emily stated firmly, but your concern is noted. Not merely concern, Miss Wilson, professional obligation. Hayes straightened his already impeccable cuffs. As Pine Valley's banker, I handle correspondence with Eastern financial institutions, including occasional communications from Wilson Banking and Trust regarding territorial investments. Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. You've had communication with my father's bank? More specifically, with your father himself. Hayes produced an envelope from his inner pocket. This arrived by express courier yesterday, addressed to you in my care. Henry Wilson apparently made inquiries after his daughter failed to arrive at her intended destination and learned you had traveled to Wyoming Territory instead. The envelope, heavy cream stationery bearing the Wilson banking letterhead, represented everything Emily had fled. She accepted it with outward composure that belied her internal turmoil. Thank you for delivering this, Mr. Hayes. I'd be remiss not to mention that your father's letter to me expressed grave concern for your welfare, Hayes added, his solicitous tone contradicted by the satisfaction in his eyes. He specifically inquired whether you had fallen prey to unscrupulous influences given your inexperience with frontier opportunists. The implication was unmistakable. Hayes insinuating that Jack had somehow manipulated or taken advantage of her, while simultaneously positioning himself as her father's concerned proxy. Before Emily could formulate an appropriately cutting response, Jack's voice interrupted from directly behind her. Mr. Hayes, he acknowledged, his tone neutral but his stance protective as he moved to Emily's side. I see you've delivered correspondence. Pine Valley appreciates your attention to postal duties alongside your banking responsibilities. The subtle implication that Hayes was functioning as a mere mail carrier rather than an important financial officer caused a flush of annoyance to cross the banker's features. Merely extending professional courtesy to the daughter of a respected Eastern colleague, he replied stiffly. Henry Wilson's concerns for his daughter's welfare merit prompt attention. Jack's expression revealed nothing, but Emily sensed his immediate understanding of the situation. Hayes attempting to establish himself as a connection to her father and, by extension, to Wilson Banking's considerable influence. The bankers, Transparent maneuvering might have been amusing if it didn't represent the first tangible link between Emily's past and her uncertain future. Miss Wilson makes her own decisions regarding correspondence, Jack stated simply. If you'll excuse us, we have supplies to finish selecting before weather changes. The dismissal was polite, but firm. Hayes nodded with exaggerated courtesy, his gaze lingering on Emily. Of course. Miss Wilson knows where to find me, should she require assistance with any banking matters or communications with her family. After he departed, Jack turned to Emily with a questioning look. Your father has discovered your location. It wasn't a question, but Emily nodded confirmation anyway, the envelope heavy in her hand. Apparently so, though how he connected me to Wyoming Territory specifically remains unclear. Hayes would have informed him immediately upon learning your identity, Jack observed. Currying favor with Eastern banking interests is his specialty. You seem familiar with his methods. A shadow crossed Jack's features. The Pine Valley Bank holds notes on several neighboring ranches. Hayes extends credit generously when Eastern capital flows freely, then restricts terms ruthlessly when markets tighten. Your father would find his business practices familiar. The implied criticism of both bankers might have offended Emily weeks earlier. Now, she merely nodded, recognizing the pattern from overheard discussions in her father's study. What happens when the bank restricts terms? For the ranchers, I mean. Best case, they sell livestock at unfavorable prices to make payments. Worst case, they lose everything like my family did. Jack's expression remained carefully neutral despite the personal reference. Hayes has foreclosed on 3 properties this year already. Emily thought of the numerous foreclosure notices she had seen on her father's desk throughout her childhood, documents that represented financial transactions to Henry Wilson but clearly signified destroyed lives to those affected. The distance between those perspectives suddenly seemed vast and unbridgeable. We should complete our purchases, she said, tucking her father's unopened letter into her pocket. The clouds are building. Jack studied her for a moment, clearly, noting her decision to postpone reading her father's message, but he merely nodded agreement. Reynolds should have the flour and sugar measured by now. Anything else you need? Writing paper and ink, Emily replied, and perhaps some yarn if they have suitable quality. They completed their shopping efficiently, loading supplies into the wagon while dark clouds gathered over the mountains to the west. Emily maintained composed pleasantries with Reynolds and other townspeople who approached, but she felt their speculative gazes and registered the whispered comments that followed. Their progress through town. As they prepared to depart, Margaret Foster emerged from the boarding house, hurrying toward their wagon with determined steps. Jack nodded respectfully as she approached. Mrs. Foster, good timing. We were just leaving. Precisely why I hurried. Over, she replied briskly. A moment with Miss Wilson, if you don't mind. Jack glanced at the threatening sky, but stepped away to give them privacy, moving to secure a tarp over the wagon's contents against potential rain. Mrs. Foster turned to Emily with unexpected warmth. You look well. Ranch life agrees with you, it seems. It's been educational, Emily acknowledged, touched by the older woman's genuine interest. Mrs. Winters is an excellent teacher. Edith, Winters doesn't suffer fools or shirkers. Her approval isn't easily earned. Mrs. Foster glanced toward Jack, lowering her voice. Word travels, even from isolated ranches. The hands who came through town yesterday mentioned you're making changes to the household. Improvements, they called them. Emily smiled slightly. Nothing dramatic. Just organizational efficiencies Mrs. Winters has been kind enough to implement. Efficiency isn't kindness on the frontier, it's survival. Mrs. Foster's expression grew serious. I should warn you that Hayes has been making inquiries about Sunset Ranch's financial standing. Unusually specific questions about Jack's loan payments and cattle prospects. A chill of apprehension ran through Emily. Recently, since your arrival. Mrs. Foster's shrewd eyes missed nothing. Hayes was quite put out when you declined his offer, and now it appears he's corresponding with your father. I don't believe in coincidences, Miss Wilson, particularly where banking is concerned. Before Emily could respond, Jack returned, his expression questioning as he noted their serious conversation. Mrs. Foster smoothly shifted topics, mentioning expected winter snowfall with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to frontier discretion. As they departed Pine Valley, heavy clouds darkened the horizon, bringing early twilight to the landscape. Emily remained silent, her thoughts churning with implications of Hayes's behavior and her father's discovered interest in her whereabouts. The unopened letter pressed against her like a physical weight. Storms moving faster than expected, Jack observed, as the first fat raindrops struck the wagon. He handed Emily an oilcloth to wrap around her shoulders. "We'll push through rather than seeking shelter. Better to reach the ranch than be caught halfway." The decision made practical sense, but Emily suspected it was equally motivated by Jack's desire to put distance between themselves and Pine Valley, specifically between Emily and Daniel Hayes with his connection to Henry Wilson. The thought that Jack might be protecting her from her father's influence created conflicting emotions she wasn't prepared to examine. The rain intensified rapidly, driven by gusting wind that bent prairie grasses and set aspen leaves trembling. Robert Parker rode ahead to scout creek crossings that might have risen with sudden runoff, leaving Jack and Emily alone on the wagon seat beneath the inadequate shelter of his broad-brimmed hat. "You haven't read it?" Jack noted during a brief lull in the downpour, nodding toward the pocket where Emily had stored her father's letter. "No," she admitted. "I'm not certain I'm ready for whatever ultimatum it contains." Jack guided the horses carefully around a muddy section of trail. "Ultimatums require enforcement. Your father is in New York. His influence extends considerably." "Father," Emily replied grimly. "Hayes made that abundantly clear." "Hayes is one banker in a small territorial town," Jack countered. "His power has limits." Emily studied Jack's profile, wondering how a man so intimately acquainted with banking devastation could underestimate Henry Wilson's reach. "My father doesn't recognize limits, Mr. Miller. Not geographical, not ethical, not even familial. When he discovers his daughter has fled an advantageous marriage to take up residence with a rancher whose family history includes Wilson bank foreclosure." She left the sentence unfinished, the implications hanging between them. Jack's hands tightened on the reins. "You believe he'll intervene?" "I know he will," Emily corrected softly. "The only questions are how quickly and through what means." They rode in silence, broken only by rainfall and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Emily found herself studying the man beside her, with new awareness, not as the antagonist her father's business practices had created, nor as the potential husband her own choices had presented, but as someone who might soon face Henry Wilson's formidable opposition. Jack Miller had rebuilt from devastating loss through years of grueling work and sacrifice. He had reclaimed his family's land and established a prosperous operation through stubborn perseverance against tremendous odds. Yet all of that might prove insufficient against the financial machinery Henry Wilson could deploy once he identified Jack as an obstacle to his daughter's return. The ranch appeared through sheets of rain, just as daylight failed completely. Windows glowing with lantern light, barn doors standing open in welcome, the silhouettes of ranch hands moving quickly to assist with the team and supplies. Jack brought the wagon to a halt in the sheltered courtyard, jumping down immediately to help with the horses, while Robert directed unloading of essential supplies that couldn't remain exposed to rainfall overnight. Emily climbed down unassisted, her sodden skirts heavy despite the oilcloth's protection. Mrs. Winters appeared at the kitchen door, beckoning her inside with practical urgency rather than fussing over her bedraggled state. Get those wet things off before you catch your death. Hot baths waiting in your room. The promised bath, water heated and carried upstairs by the kitchen girls while Emily changed into dry clothing, represented luxury beyond anything she had expected. As she sank into steaming water scented with pine needles, Emily found herself unexpectedly moved by the thoughtfulness underlying the frontier practicality. Mrs. Winters had anticipated her needs and addressed them without fanfare, demonstrating care through action rather than words. Later, warm and dry in a woolen wrapper, Emily finally removed her father's letter from the damp pocket of her discarded dress. The heavy paper had weathered the journey remarkably well, the Wilson banking letterhead still crisply embossed above his distinctive handwriting. She broke the seal with steady hands, determined to face whatever demands or manipulations awaited. The letter's contents proved simultaneously predictable and disturbing. Henry Wilson expressed neither paternal concern nor emotional distress over his daughter's departure, but rather outrage at the inconvenience and potential business complications created by her absence. Lawrence Blackwell had apparently taken great offense at being rejected by a Wilson, causing tension in business negotiations worth millions. More troubling were the specific details her father included, not merely her general location in Wyoming Territory, but explicit mention of residence with J. Miller at Sunset Ranch, property formerly held by Wilson Banking during '73 reconciliation. The precision of this information confirmed Emily's suspicion that Hayes had been providing detailed reports. The letter's conclusion left no room for misinterpretation. You will return to New York immediately upon receipt of this communication. Arrangements have been made for your transportation from Pine Valley. Continued defiance will necessitate measures you will find most unpleasant. The Miller property's financial standing has been thoroughly investigated and found precarious. Consider carefully whether your romantic notions are worth the consequences to those sheltering you. The threat was unmistakable. If Emily refused to return voluntarily, her father would target Sunset Ranch financially, using his considerable banking connections to create difficulties that could potentially cost Jack everything he had rebuilt. The cruelty of this approach, threatening the livelihood of someone who had already suffered devastating loss due to Wilson banking practices, revealed her father's character with painful clarity. Emily placed the letter on her small writing desk, her initial anger giving way to strategic consideration. Henry Wilson clearly believed his daughter incapable of independence or meaningful resistance. He assumed financial threats would overcome any attachment she might have formed, that her romantic notions represented mere rebellion rather than genuine desire for self-determination. More importantly, he underestimated the resourcefulness she had inherited from him, the ability to analyze situations dispassionately and identify leverage points others might overlook. Emily had spent years observing her father's business operations, absorbing his methods while developing her own ethical boundaries. Now she would apply that education to protecting herself and Sunset Ranch from his manipulations. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Wilson," Mrs. Winters called through the door. "Supper's ready when you are. Nothing fancy, just stew and biscuits after the long day." "Thank you, Mrs. Winters. I'll be down shortly." Emily quickly dressed in her warmest garments, tucking her father's letter into her journal for safekeeping. The immediate challenge was clear. She needed information about Sunset Ranch's actual financial position before she could develop effective counter-strategies to her father's threats. In the dining room, she found Jack and Robert already seated. Their conversation focused on potential flooding at the North Creek crossing. Both men rose briefly as she entered, a courtesy that seemed incongruous given their rain-soaked day of physical labor, yet touching in its sincerity. "The bath was most appreciated," Emily said to Mrs. Winters as she served steaming bowls of fragrant stew. I haven't been that thoroughly drenched since falling into the pond at Central Park as a child. Her deliberate lightness established a tone of normalcy, despite the day's complex developments. Jack studied her with quiet intensity that suggested awareness of her omissions. She had mentioned neither Hayes's insinuations nor her father's letter, but he merely nodded acknowledgement of her comment. "Wyoming weather changes without consultation," he observed dryly. Today's demonstration was relatively mild by territorial standards. Conversation through dinner remained focused on practical matters: supplies acquired, weather forecasts for coming days, preparations needed before the first significant snowfall. Emily participated appropriately while observing interactions between Jack and Robert with new awareness of underlying tensions. The foreman clearly disagreed with certain ranch management decisions, his respectful phrasing barely concealing frustrated concern about financial constraints mentioned obliquely, through references to limited options and necessary priorities. After Robert departed for evening rounds, Emily found herself alone with Jack in the main room, Mrs. Winters having retired to her quarters adjacent to the kitchen. The rain continued steadily outside, creating a cocoon of isolation punctuated by occasional thunder that seemed to emphasize their separation from the wider world. "Your father's letter contained unwelcome news," Jack stated without preamble, pouring himself a small measure of whiskey from a cabinet near the cold fireplace. He offered the glass to Emily, who declined with a small shake of her head. The direct acknowledgement of what she had withheld during dinner startled her briefly before understanding dawned. "Hayes mentioned the letter's arrival to you separately." "With considerable satisfaction," Jack confirmed, taking the chair opposite hers. "He seemed quite certain you would be departing for New York imminently upon your father's instructions." Emily's estimation of Hayes's character diminished further. "He misunderstands my relationship with my father if he believes I respond to commands like a trained hunting dog." A glimmer of amusement softened Jack's expression. "Is that how Henry Wilson manages his banking empire? Through commands and trained responses? Through manipulation, leverage, and exploitation of vulnerabilities?" Emily corrected with unflinching honesty. "Methods Hayes appears eager to emulate, though with considerably less finesse." Jack studied her over the rim of his glass. "And what vulnerabilities has Hayes identified for exploitation in this situation?" Emily met his gaze directly, recognizing the moment for what it was, a test of her candor and loyalty. "Sunset Ranch's financial position. Specifically, your outstanding loan with options for renegotiation before winter." If Jack was surprised by her knowledge, he didn't show it. "Hayes has been unusually interested in my payment schedule recently. This explains why. My father threatened to create financial difficulties for Sunset Ranch if I don't return to New York immediately," Emily acknowledged, decision made to share the letter's contents fully. "He specifically mentioned investigating your precarious financial standing." "Precarious is an exaggeration," Jack replied with careful precision. "Challenging but manageable, assuming normal market conditions and reasonable banking practices. Neither of which my father will allow if he decides to target Sunset Ranch." Emily leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Mr. Miller, Jack, I need to understand exactly what we're facing. What leverage does Hayes have? What options exist? Beyond the Pine Valley Bank, how vulnerable is Sunset Ranch to external financial pressure?" The shift to his first name was deliberate, establishing partnership rather than formal distance in the face of common threat. Jack registered the change with a slight lift of his eyebrow but didn't comment on it directly. "The current loan represents 30% of the ranch's assessed value," he explained after a moment's consideration. "Terms include renegotiation of interest rates quarterly, with Hayes holding considerable discretion regarding adjustments. Next review falls in 3 weeks. Just enough time for my father to exert influence, Emily noted grimly. What alternatives exist for refinancing? Jack's expression revealed surprise at her technical understanding. Limited. The Cheyenne Bank requires 50% equity for cattle operations this distance from rail lines. Eastern investments typically demand controlling interest in management decisions, which you would never accept, Emily concluded, recognizing that independence was fundamental to Jack's character after his family's experience. Not after spending 12 years reclaiming what was taken, he agreed simply. I built Sunset Ranch without compromising essential principles. I won't abandon them now. The quiet conviction in his voice stirred unexpected admiration in Emily. Despite her father's ruthless business philosophy that valued profit above principles, she had always secretly respected those who maintained ethical boundaries, regardless of cost. Jack Miller had rebuilt from devastation without surrendering the moral framework that defined him, a strength of character increasingly rare in Emily's experience. Then we need alternatives your current bankers haven't considered, she said, decisively. Options that protect Sunset Ranch without requiring surrender of management authority or ownership percentage. Jack set his empty glass aside, studying her with undisguised curiosity. The question contained multiple layers: surprise at her willingness to challenge her father's demands, uncertainty about her motives, and perhaps most significantly, genuine interest in why Emily Wilson would ally herself with Sunset Ranch, against her family's interests. My father is using financial threats against this ranch to control me, Emily stated with clear-eyed pragmatism. I refuse to allow his manipulation to succeed, both for my own independence and because Sunset Ranch deserves protection from becoming collateral damage in Wilson family disputes. She paused, then added more quietly, especially given the history between our families. Jack's expression remained unreadable as he absorbed her declaration. You're proposing alliance against Henry Wilson and Daniel Hayes, two bankers, with substantial resources and influence. With what weapons exactly? Knowledge, Emily replied without hesitation. I grew up observing my father's banking operations. I understand his methods, his weaknesses, and most importantly, the alternatives he systematically eliminates from consideration because they don't align with his philosophy of maximum control. That's still rather abstract, Emily. Her name, on his lips, the first time he had used it directly, affected her more than expected, creating momentary distraction before she refocused on the practical matter at hand. I need to review Sunset Ranch's complete financial records. All accounts, contracts, loan documents, and cattle projections. Once I understand the specific situation, I can identify options Hayes and my father would overlook. The request was substantial, asking for access to information Jack had likely never shared fully with anyone, certainly not with the daughter of the banker who had foreclosed on his family's original property. His hesitation was both expected and reasonable. You're asking for considerable trust, he observed quietly. Yes, Emily acknowledged. Just as you're asking me to trust that your original invitation wasn't solely motivated by revenge against my family. The directness of her statement hung between them, illuminated by occasional lightning that briefly transformed the quiet room into stark contrasts of light and shadow. In that suspended moment, Emily recognized that whatever future might exist, for her at Sunset Ranch, whether as temporary guest or potential partner, would be determined by their mutual capacity for trust despite complicated history. Jack finally nodded, a decision visibly reached. The ranch office contains all financial records. We'll begin tomorrow. The simple statement represented significant commitment, not merely to sharing sensitive information, but to accepting Emily's assistance in confronting the challenges her father's intervention would create. It acknowledged partnership forged through circumstance rather than choice, yet partnership nonetheless. "Thank you," Emily said quietly. "I know this isn't what you anticipated when you placed that advertisement, nor what you expected when you answered it," Jack replied, the hint of a wry smile briefly softening his features. "It seems Henry Wilson and I have something in common, after all. We both underestimated your capacity for independent action." The comparison between her father and Jack, men representing fundamentally opposed values despite this single point of convergence, struck Emily as both ironic and oddly hopeful. If Jack Miller could acknowledge connection to Henry Wilson, however limited, perhaps reconciliation was possible between Eastern financial power and Western resilience. More immediately, it suggested Jack's willingness to move beyond historical grievance toward pragmatic collaboration, a perspective Emily would need if she hoped to develop strategies protecting both her independence and Sunset Ranch's future. "Tomorrow then," she agreed, rising from her chair. "And in the meantime, I believe I owe Mrs. Winters a piano recital, weather permitting." Jack's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something more complex. Perhaps memory, perhaps anticipation. "Mother always played during storms," said music balanced nature's percussion. He stood, maintaining careful distance. "Good night, Emily. We'll face banking challenges after breakfast." As Emily climbed the stairs to her room, she found herself contemplating the day's unexpected developments with emotions too complicated for simple categorization. Her father's discovered intervention had accelerated decisions she had hoped to make at a measured pace, forcing alignment with Jack against external threat before they had fully resolved their internal complexities. Yet, within that pressure, something valuable had emerged. Honest recognition of shared purpose, despite different backgrounds and motivations. Jack Miller might have initially invited a Wilson to Wyoming Territory with complicated intentions, but tonight he had chosen alliance with that Wilson against banking interests that threatened his hard-won independence. The rain continued through the night, its steady rhythm gradually slowing as the storm moved eastward. Emily stood at her window, watching occasional lightning illuminate the distant mountains, thinking of her father in his New York office, so certain of his daughter's compliance that he had already arranged transportation from Pine Valley. Henry Wilson would soon discover that the daughter he had raised to appreciate financial strategy had learned those lessons more thoroughly than he realized, and would now apply them to protecting rather than exploiting vulnerable communities. Whatever challenges tomorrow's financial revelations might bring, Emily faced them with growing confidence in her ability to craft solutions her father would never anticipate from his limited perspective. She finally turned from the window and opened her journal, recording observations that would form the foundation of tomorrow's strategy session. Banking operates on principles that transcend location, access to capital, management of risk, and alignment of incentives. Father believes these principles can only be implemented through institutional control and leveraged debt. Tomorrow, I hope to demonstrate that alternative approaches exist, methods that preserve independence while creating mutual benefit. The Visa frontier demands innovation in finance just as it requires adaptation in all other aspects of survival. Hayes's departure left a tension in the air that lingered like the dust from his buggy wheels. Emily stood on the porch long after the banker had disappeared from view, watching the shadows lengthen across the yard as the sun dipped toward the mountains. Jack moved beside her, his presence solid and reassuring without being intrusive. "My father won't accept this defiance," Emily said finally, voicing the concern that weighed on her mind. "He'll view it as more than just personal disobedience. He'll see it as a challenge to his entire way of doing business." Jack nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Hayes will telegraph him immediately. How long before we see a response?" 3 days at most, Emily calculated. Father maintains connections with telegraph operators who prioritize his communications. He'll likely send someone with more authority than Hayes, possibly Lawrence Blackwell himself. The man you were supposed to marry? Jack's voice held a note of surprise. Would he come personally? It would appeal to his sense of ownership, Emily replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her tone. A chance to retrieve wayward property while simultaneously exploring potential mining investments in the territory. Father would consider it efficient use of resources. The ranch hands were returning from the day's work, their figures silhouetted against the sunset as they led tired horses toward the barn. Emily watched them with new appreciation for the straightforward honesty of their labor. So different from the manipulative maneuverings of New York business. We need to accelerate our plans with Cooper, she said decisively, and approach at least 2 other ranches tomorrow about similar arrangements. The more alternatives we establish before my father's representative arrives, the stronger our position. Jack studied her with undisguised admiration. You're remarkably strategic for someone who claims to have been excluded from business education. I observed more than anyone realized, Emily admitted. When men believe women are merely decorative, they speak freely in their presence. I've attended countless dinners where banking strategies were discussed as if I were no more sentient than the silverware. A hint of a smile touched Jack's lips. Their mistake. That evening after dinner, they gathered in Jack's study with Robert Parker and Mrs. Winters, sharing the details of their financial planning and the success of their meeting with Cooper. The foreman listened intently, occasionally asking pointed questions about implementation timelines and potential obstacles. Mrs. Winters remained silent until they had finished, her practical mind clearly processing implications. So you're gutting out the bank entirely? She summarized, her tone suggesting approval beneath the neutrality. Creating your own financing network among the ranches. Direct exchange of specialized value without institutional intermediation. Emily confirmed. Allowing mutually beneficial arrangements structured around actual operational needs rather than standardized banking requirements. Robert leaned forward, his weathered face serious. Hayes won't take this lying down. He's built his position on controlling capital flow throughout the county. If ranches start organizing independent exchanges, his power diminishes considerably, which is precisely why we need to establish multiple arrangements quickly, Jack replied. Hayes can pressure any single ranch, but coordinated community response becomes much more difficult to undermine. They developed a comprehensive plan for the coming days. Jack and Robert would ride to Johnson's Spread the following morning, while Emily drafted detailed proposals for 3 additional operations within reasonable distance. Mrs. Winters would handle communications with Cooper to finalize immediate implementation details for the breeding stock transfer. What about Hayes's threat to accelerate your loan review? Robert asked, addressing the most immediate vulnerability. We're requesting meeting with the Pine Valley Bank's board of directors, Emily explained. Presenting alternative repayment schedule that addresses their legitimate concerns while highlighting problematic aspects of Hayes's administration. She smiled slightly. Having observed countless banking negotiations, I'm familiar with effective approaches to concerned directors who prioritize institutional stability over individual manager ambitions. The strategic thoroughness of their planning created energy that overshadowed the exhaustion of the long day. As the meeting concluded and Robert departed for final evening checks, Mrs. Winters paused at the door with an assessing look at Emily. You've made your choice then, she stated rather than asked, staying at Sunset Ranch and fighting Wilson Banking directly. Emily met the older woman's gaze steadily. I've chosen self-determination over controlled existence. Whether that ultimately includes permanent connection to Sunset Ranch specifically remains appropriately undetermined. The careful distinction, claiming independence without presuming permanent place, earned approving nod from Mrs. Winters, who recognized balanced assessment where defensive justification might have emerged instead. "Good," she stated simply. "Choices should be made from strength rather than necessity. Night, you two. Don't stay up planning revolutions against Eastern banking too late. Tomorrow comes early regardless." After her departure, Emily and Jack found themselves alone in the study, surrounded by maps and financial projections that represented their collaborative vision. The lamplight cast warm shadows across the room, creating intimacy that neither acknowledged directly, yet both felt with increasing awareness. "Your father underestimated you profoundly," Jack observed, gathering scattered papers into ordered arrangement. "Banking empires aren't typically vulnerable to challenges from daughters. They've attempted to marry off to business associates." Emily smiled slightly as she organized her own notes. "Father believes women incapable of strategic thinking beyond social maneuvering. He raised me with banking education because he assumed I'd merely apply it to managing household accounts." As Lawrence Blackwell's wife, she met Jack's gaze directly. He never considered I might find different application for those skills. Creating alternative financial structures in Wyoming Territory certainly qualifies as different application, Jack acknowledged with rare humor lighting his features. "Though I imagine it wasn't among the futures Henry Wilson envisioned for his daughter." "No more than you envisioned financial revolution when placing advertisement for mail-order bride," Emily countered, their shared ironic appreciation of circumstances creating unexpected lightness amid serious planning. Jack's expression shifted toward thoughtful assessment that contained elements beyond strategic partnership. "When your letter first arrived from Fifth Avenue, I saw opportunity for understanding Wilson banking mentality from inside perspective. I never anticipated discovering alliance rather than opposition." The honest acknowledgement of evolved perception created space for Emily's matching candor. "When I first arrived at Sunset Ranch, I saw temporary refuge from arranged marriage. Rather than potential partnership, I never anticipated discovering purpose beyond personal escape." Their mutual recognition of transformed understanding hung between them, neither requiring immediate resolution nor demanding premature definition. Whatever relationship might eventually emerge between them would develop from shared purpose and demonstrated character rather than convenient arrangement or romantic illusion. "We should rest," Jack suggested, extinguishing surplus lamps as they concluded evening planning. "Tomorrow brings significant implementation requirements alongside potential opposition development." Emily nodded agreement, appreciating his consistent balance between acknowledging personal evolution and maintaining practical focus on immediate challenges. As they moved through the quiet house toward their separate rooms, she found herself reflecting on the profound distance traveled. Since departing New York, measured not in miles, but in fundamentally transformed self-perception. Henry Wilson had raised his daughter to become decorative asset within banking empire expansion, educated enough to appreciate proper social positioning, yet constrained from applying knowledge toward independent determination. His daughter had, indeed, absorbed those lessons thoroughly, understanding precisely which mechanisms required dismantling to create genuine choice where artificial constraints had previously dominated. Morning arrived with crystalline clarity that matched Emily's resolved determination. She dressed in her most practical riding outfit, anticipating active participation in arrangements rather than passive documentation of male-dominated negotiations. When she descended to breakfast, she found Jack and Robert already reviewing maps of neighboring spreads with updated annotations regarding potential collaborative opportunities. Johnson's operation lies northwest, Jack explained, indicating location on roughly sketched regional map. Specializes in hay production alongside modest cattle operation. Potential complementary supply arrangements beyond breeding stock exchange. Emily immediately grasped strategic implications. Diversifying collaborative arrangements beyond single commodity exchange, creating integrated regional network addressing multiple operational requirements simultaneously. Robert's expression revealed growing appreciation for her technical understanding alongside practical application perspective. Exactly. Johnson needs breeding stock improvements but offers premium hay access during shortage periods. Mutually beneficial exchange opportunity without requiring banking intermediation. Their collaborative planning continued through breakfast, Emily contributing structural recommendations based on financial principles, while Jack and Robert provided operational details reflecting territorial realities. Mrs. Winters observed their interaction with quiet approval, her initial skepticism regarding Emily's potential contribution having evolved toward clear recognition of complementary partnership. As they prepared for departure, Emily riding alongside Jack and Robert rather than remaining at ranch headquarters, Mrs. Winters pressed package of food into her hands with practical focus that nevertheless conveyed deeper acknowledgement. Negotiating requires sustenance, she stated simply. Johnson appreciates straightforward approach without excessive elaboration. Emily's directness will serve well there. The transition to first-name basis, unannounced yet significant, represented Mrs. Winters' tacit acceptance of Emily's legitimate place within ranch operations beyond temporary arrangement or contingent presence. Emily received this acknowledgement with appropriate appreciation for its measured award rather than automatic extension. "Thank you," she replied with matching directness, "for guidance beyond practical provisions." Their journey to Johnson's spread covered steeper terrain than previous days' ride to Cooper's operation, requiring careful navigation across rocky slopes and narrow valleys. Emily managed the challenges with growing confidence, her riding skills developing through necessity rather than formal instruction. Jack occasionally offered suggestions regarding trail approach or saddle position, but primarily allowed her independent management of mount and path. "You've adapted quickly to territorial requirements," he observed during brief rest along creek crossing. "Most eastern visitors require considerably longer transition period before attempting such riding routes." Necessity proves effective. "Instructor," Emily replied, appreciating his acknowledgement without false modesty, "though I suspect my muscles will register complaints tomorrow morning." Their arrival at Johnson's operation revealed modest but well-maintained ranch headquarters. Main house, smaller than Sunset Ranch but solidly constructed. Outbuildings arranged for practical efficiency rather than impressive display. Thomas Johnson himself met them in the yard, his tall frame stooped slightly from years of physical labor, yet maintaining dignity that commanded immediate respect. "Miller," he acknowledged with brief nod, "Parker, and—" His gaze assessed Emily, with undisguised curiosity about female presence in business discussion context. "Emily Wilson," Jack introduced without elaboration regarding specific relationship definition, collaborating on financial structure development for regional operational enhancements. The deliberate technical framing, presenting Emily through professional capacity rather than personal connection, established immediate parameters emphasizing legitimate participation beyond traditional gender expectations. Johnson processed this introduction with thoughtful consideration before offering weathered hand in greeting acceptance. Thomas Johnson heard talk of Eastern Lady at Sunset Ranch, didn't expect direct involvement in regional planning development. "Specialized knowledge proves valuable regardless of origin," Emily replied, meeting his direct assessment with matching, forthright engagement. Financial structure innovation offers mutual benefit possibilities beyond conventional arrangements. Johnson's expression registered surprise, followed by appreciative recognition of substantive contribution rather than decorative presence. He led them toward main house with conversational focus, immediately addressing practical operational matters rather than social formalities or gender-based distinctions. As they settled at kitchen table with coffee provided by Johnson's sister, who managed household operations, Emily observed subtle differences in approach compared to Cooper's more formal interaction style. Johnson prioritized immediate practical application over theoretical framework, requiring concrete examples before engaging broader conceptual possibilities. "Show me specifics," he requested after Jack outlined general collaborative proposal. "How exactly breeding stock exchange translates to operational advantage beyond conventional purchase arrangements." Emily recognized opportunity to demonstrate technical understanding alongside practical application perspective. She sketched structured exchange framework on provided paper, timeline correlating breeding cycle implementation with hay production schedule, payment arrangements aligned with seasonal operation requirements, and value calculations reflecting specialized genetics rather than standardized market metrics. "Direct operational alignment," she explained, indicating correlation points between complementary production cycles, eliminating artificial financial barriers while maximizing natural efficiency opportunities already present within regional production patterns. Johnson studied proposal with focused attention, reflecting genuine consideration rather than polite dismissal. His questions addressed specific implementation details rather than conceptual framework, indicating fundamental acceptance of approach alongside practical operation concerns. By midday discussion, conceptual agreement had evolved towards specific implementation planning addressing immediate transfer logistics alongside longer-term operational integration. "Makes practical sense," Johnson concluded, reviewing finalized framework documentation. "Banking extracts premium without adding equivalent value to actual operations. Direct exchange between operations creates mutual benefit without unnecessary intermediation costs." The fundamental recognition, banking serving institutional interests often opposed to operational requirements, represented precisely the awareness Emily's father had systematically suppressed through controlled information access and artificial dependency creation. Hearing this understanding articulated through practical frontier assessment rather than theoretical analysis confirmed potential for genuine alternative development beyond isolated arrangement implementation. Their return journey to Sunset Ranch proceeded with energy born from successful engagement rather than physical exhaustion. 3 operations now actively participated in collaborative framework development: Cooper's Spread, Johnson's Operation, and Sunset Ranch establishing foundation for regional network rather than isolated exchange arrangement. Emily found herself developing expanded application possibilities alongside immediate implementation requirements, creating sustainable alternative structures rather than temporary banking avoidance mechanisms. Johnson will communicate with Harrison's operation, east of Pine Valley, Robert noted as they rode, creating connection beyond Hayes's immediate influence circle while maintaining regional integration possibilities. Emily immediately grasped strategic implication beyond specific operational collaboration. Network expansion through established relationship pathways rather than centralized coordination, creating distributed resilience against targeted intervention attempts. Jack nodded appreciation for her immediate understanding alongside practical implementation insight. Exactly. Hayes can pressure individual operations through banking leverage, but interconnected exchange network develops resilience against isolated targeting strategies. Their collaborative strategic assessment continued throughout return journey, each contributing perspective from different experience background, yet developing synchronous application understanding. Emily found herself appreciating intellectual partnership beyond immediate practical benefits, valuing inherent satisfaction from working alongside people who respected her capabilities without qualification or constraint. As Sunset Ranch appeared on horizon, golden in late afternoon light, Emily felt unexpected emotion regarding this property she had initially approached with trepidation. In mere weeks, the ranch had transformed from stranger's domain to potential home, place where her abilities found genuine application and her presence genuine value. Whether her future ultimately remained connected to Sunset Ranch specifically, or carried her toward different application context, Emily recognized with profound certainty that returning to New York's restricted expectations had become impossible. Riders approaching from town direction, Robert observed, indicating dust clouds visible along Eastern Approach Road. Multiple horses moving with purpose, rather than casual travel pace. Jack immediately shifted attention toward potential threat assessment, his expression reflecting calculated evaluation rather than emotional response. 3 riders minimum, traveling deliberately without apparent concern about visibility or approach announcement. Emily felt momentary apprehension, followed by strategic calculation, replacing reactive anxiety. Hayes likely received response instructions from my father already, sending representatives with perceived authority rather than coming personally after previous unsuccessful attempt. They adjusted course to intercept approaching riders before reaching ranch headquarters, positioning encounter on neutral territory rather than allowing apparent authority demonstration through uninvited arrival at private residence. As distance closed between groups, Emily recognized Daniel Hayes leading 2 unfamiliar men whose clothing and posture suggested Eastern origin rather than territorial residence. Miss Wilson, Hayes called as groups halted within conversation distance. These gentlemen represent Lawrence Blackwell's interests regarding your immediate return to New York. Mr. Blackwell himself arrives tomorrow to escort you personally. The announcement, intended to create intimidation through implied authority, instead clarified tactical timeline while confirming Emily's prediction regarding her father's escalation approach. She maintained composed expression, revealing nothing of internal strategic assessment while evaluating newcomers with practiced social observation. Mr. Hayes, she acknowledged with minimal courtesy before addressing companions directly. Gentlemen, you've traveled considerable distance without apparent invitation to private property. Your association with Mr. Blackwell suggests business, relationship, rather than personal connection justifying such presumption. The deliberate challenge, questioning legitimacy of their presence while highlighting improper incursion onto private property, shifted interaction dynamics from their planned authority demonstration toward defensive justification requirement. The older visitor appeared momentarily disconcerted before recovering professional demeanor, suggesting legal training. Miss Wilson, I am James Morrison, legal representative for Lawrence Blackwell Enterprises. This document, he extended sealed, envelope with formal flourish, constitutes formal communication from Henry Wilson, requesting your immediate return under family authority provisions recognized under territorial law. Emily accepted envelope without opening it, maintaining composed expression that revealed nothing of internal tactical assessment. Thank you for delivery service, Mr. Morrison. While I appreciate messenger function performance, legal correspondence requires proper review before meaningful response formulation. The deliberately formal phrasing, acknowledging receipt while establishing independent evaluation rather than immediate compliance, visibly unsettled Morrison, who had apparently anticipated either emotional resistance or immediate acquiescence, rather than composed procedural acknowledgement. Mr. Blackwell has arranged transportation departing Pine Valley tomorrow afternoon, Hayes interjected, attempting to re-establish authority impression through specific schedule imposition. His personal attention to this matter reflects significant importance beyond mere family communication. Jack entered conversation with calculated precision that effectively rebalanced interaction dynamics without creating unnecessary confrontation. Sunset Ranch acknowledges visitor arrival notification. Miss Wilson will review correspondence with appropriate consideration timeline rather than artificial urgency imposition. He gestured toward ranch headquarters visible in distance. While unexpected arrival precludes proper hospitality preparation, basic courtesy requirements suggest offering refreshment following your journey. Would you care to accompany us to the main house? The deliberate social protocol application, treating them as visitors requiring basic courtesy rather than authorities commanding compliance, further disrupted their prepared approach without creating direct confrontation justification. Morrison and his companion exchanged uncertain glances before Hayes intervened with obvious frustration regarding derailed intimidation strategy. "We have accommodations arranged in Pine Valley," he stated with poorly concealed irritation. "Miss Wilson, Mr. Blackwell specifically instructed." "Mr. Blackwell holds no authority regarding my schedule or location," Emily interrupted with calm precision that effectively neutralized attempted intimidation. "While I appreciate delivery of family correspondence, response timing remains my determination rather than external scheduling imposition." The clear boundary establishment, rejecting presumed authority while maintaining composed rationality, left little effective response beyond dignified withdrawal or escalation beyond social propriety boundaries. Morrison apparently recognized tactical disadvantage within current interaction parameters, selecting professional retreat over ineffective confrontation continuation. "We shall inform Mr. Blackwell of successful correspondence delivery," he stated with formal correctness, masking evident disappointment regarding mission effectiveness. "He anticipates your response upon his arrival tomorrow." Their departure carried considerably less authority impression than arrival approach had. Attempted to establish 3 riders returning toward town with neither compliance achievement nor effective intimidation establishment. Emily maintained composed expression until distance rendered observation impossible, before allowing momentary tension release through deep breath. "Lawrence arrives tomorrow," she noted quietly, the personal connection implied through first name. Reference revealing complicated history beyond mere arranged marriage avoidance. Father sending him personally represents escalation beyond standard representative deployment. Jack studied her with perceptive assessment that recognized underlying concern beneath composed exterior. "This, Lawrence Blackwell, holds significance beyond business association with your father. He's built his fortune acquiring distressed properties during financial panics," Emily explained as they resumed journey toward ranch headquarters. "Father admires his decisive acquisition methodology while ignoring human consequences of his approaches." She met Jack's gaze directly. 3 previous wives died within 5 years of marriage. Official causes listed as various illnesses, though certain social circles question isolation patterns and restricted medical access preceding their deaths. The disturbing implication, arranged marriage threatening more than mere independence, limitation, created momentary silence as Jack processed wider significance beyond immediate tactical challenge. "Your father arranged your marriage to such man despite these concerning patterns?" he finally asked, genuine confusion evident beneath controlled expression. Father evaluates relationships through financial advantage rather than personal welfare. Considerations, Emily replied with painful candor regarding family dynamics reality. Lawrence controls mining interests father covets for portfolio diversification. My marriage represented merger arrangement rather than personal relationship consideration. The frank acknowledgement, presenting Henry Wilson's priorities without defensive justification or emotional elaboration, revealed fundamental character assessment based on observed pattern recognition rather than reactive emotional response. Jack received this revelation with thoughtful consideration that further deepened respect for Emily's composed, strategic thinking despite personally disturbing circumstances. Tomorrow, then, he stated simply, accepting her assessment while focusing on immediate tactical requirements rather than emotional processing distractions. We've established initial collaborative network foundations. Lawrence Blackwell's arrival accelerates timeline rather than fundamentally changing strategic approach requirements. Emily nodded agreement, appreciating his balanced focus on practical necessities while acknowledging significance without dramatic emphasis. Cooper's implementation should proceed immediately, rather than awaiting further arrangement confirmations. Creating established precedent before Lawrence attempts intervention provides stronger position than merely proposed framework discussion. Their collaborative planning continued through evening, practical measures developed against anticipated opposition, while deeper connection emerged through shared purpose, transcending immediate tactical requirements. Whatever Henry Wilson might deploy through Lawrence Blackwell's arrival, their developing alternative structures had created foundation for genuine resistance beyond mere individual defiance. As Emily retired that evening, she found herself considering remarkable distance traveled since departing New York, measured not through physical miles, but through fundamentally transformed perception regarding possibility and purpose. She had departed seeking merely escape from arranged marriage constraint, yet discovered instead capacity for meaningful contribution beyond decorative existence. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring through Lawrence Blackwell's arrival, Emily faced them with growing confidence in her ability to craft solutions her father would never anticipate from his limited perspective. She had discovered agency beyond prescribed limitations, partnership beyond patriarchal arrangement, and community beyond social stratification. The rich girl who had fled city life for frontier independence had indeed walked unknowingly into revenge plot conceived through historical grievance. Yet within that unexpected circumstance, Emily Wilson had discovered not victimization, but opportunity, creating alliance beyond familial expectation while developing partnership based on mutual capability recognition rather than convenient arrangement. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she would face it standing alongside Jack Miller and the community they had begun building together, not as mail-order bride nor banking victim, but as capable woman actively creating alternatives where none had previously existed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.